It is a practice of faith where you recognize there must be some meaning here. There's something important about this. When you can actually have that deep sense that, God, this is painful, but you can learn from it. You can grow from it. And it takes time, like any sort of recovery from trauma. Inevitably, we blame ourselves when something bad happens, even if there's no moral sense we should be blaming ourselves. Forgiveness is a really important first step. And I lay out 3 steps to forgiveness. The first step is, the second step is, and the third step I have a funny name for, and you don't have to be religious to appreciate this step. I call it good sex. I simply mean, good sex is when it's not just sex. I have 3 levels. I have plain old sex, good sex, and sacred sex. Plain old sex simply requires couples need those moments of intimacy as much as they need stability. Sacred sex, to get from good sex to sacred, it's really more about the vast majority of couples I work with, they're not having stability issues. More often they're having intimacy issues. It's not something you can engineer. It's something you can lay the groundwork for.
Hey everybody, quick break on our episode to talk to you about our sponsor, My Libido Doc. One of the things that we truly believe is that great sex is available to everyone, but we just have to learn how. So head over to our site to get your free copy of our ebook, 5 Steps to Mind-Blowing Orgasms and Romance. Get the quick and easy tips to turn your sex life around, rev up your engines, and fall in deeper love and passion with yourself and your partner. So if you just go to mysexdoc.com, you will find that ebook there for download. Now back to our show. Hey everybody, this is Dr. Diane, your host of the Libido Lounge. I'm so excited about today's guest, Dr. Bruce Chalmer. We are getting into so many important topics today. One of the most important topics we're going to talk about is forgiveness. And it's really cool to have Dr. Bruce on the show with me because I know this is something that I have even spent a decent amount of time myself looking up on Wikipedia and other types of platforms like that. Like, what is forgiveness and how do we define it? And I think so many times we get in our way of forgiveness and we hold this energy and we hold this frequency and the anger and all these things simply because we don't understand it. And it not only damages ourselves, but it damages the relationship. I know there's been things in my past that forgiveness has been a real challenge and a lot of personal energy working to actually forgive people in my life. And I'm really, really excited to go into this conversation today. So Bruce, thank you so much for being here with me.
Well, I'm delighted. Thanks for having me on. Yeah, it's funny to say I love to talk about forgiveness because it's a topic that involves all kinds of pain. You only need to forgive when you're in a lot of pain, but I do find it's an important thing to talk about.
And let's define it. And I think defining what is forgiveness, like I said, like it's a challenging thing. And I think due to society, due to upbringing, due to religion, we have a lot, one of the things when I've researched this is there's a lot of different definitions out there of what people actually think forgiveness is.
Yeah.
So let's start with what is forgiveness? How are you defining it?
So, if you boil them all down, I'm sure I'm oversimplifying, but if you boil them all down, there's basically 2 ways to define forgiveness. And there's the way I like and the way I don't. So I'll start with the way I don't. I say I don't like it, but it's a very common way of defining forgiveness. A lot of times when people say they'll forgive someone who's hurt them badly, what they mean is they'll restore the relationship. If I forgive someone who's hurt me, okay, I can perhaps trust them again. We'll go back to where we were. It's kind of like when people use the term forgiving a financial debt. To forgive the debt is saying, you know what, you don't owe me the money anymore. Let's just move on. That's one way of defining forgiveness. I don't like that way. And let me tell you the way I like. The way I like is where forgiveness, and I did not coin this phrase, but I love it. Forgiveness is an inside job, which is to say, I can forgive someone I don't trust at all. I can forgive someone I have absolutely no intention of restoring a relationship with. I can forgive somebody that I'm still going to sue or divorce or prosecute in court. I can forgive all kinds of people that don't, in any sort of moral sense, deserve forgiveness. I can forgive people who have no remorse, who have no understanding of what they did. In that sense, forgiveness is all about that internal sense. I can get past the essential trauma. I cannot be obsessed with it. I can think about it, have some perspective on it, recognize, yeah, well, that happened. I wish it hadn't. Maybe I understand why it did and maybe I didn't. Maybe I had a part of it and maybe I didn't. But all of that I can have perspective on, so I'm not freaking out. And that's what I mean by forgiveness. And the reason I like that better than the other one is it's empowering, because you recognize you're no longer at the mercy of someone else's attitudes, or, someone, whether or not they apologize or whatever. You're not carrying around the hurt. And I would be remiss if I didn't quote Anne Lamott that so many people quote around forgiveness, because it's a lovely quote. I'm sure I won't get the words exactly right, but she said essentially, to not forgive is like drinking rat poison and waiting for the rat to die. And as I like to point out, yeah, once you get the poison out of you, then you can worry about the rat. The rat might still be there and might still be a rat, but if you got the poison out of you, you can think more clearly. You're not distracted by panic.
Yeah, I like that definition a lot, because I think where people get stuck, and I know when I've looked this definition up, where I was getting stuck was thinking that it almost like says, okay, that behavior or that thing was okay, right? And what you're saying is like, we're not saying that, hey, whatever somebody did was maybe okay. Like, you could have been wrong, you could have been hurt, you could have been all these things. And it's not saying their behavior is okay. It's saying you're changing your nervous system response to it so that you can live a healthier life and still deal, or still say navigate, if you need to keep a relationship with that person, still navigate in a way that your nervous system can handle better. Correct?
Yes, exactly. Yeah, that's the sense, if you think of it in terms of processing trauma, to use this sort of trauma language,
Yeah.
it's like when you process the trauma, you're no longer freaking out whenever you think of it. Your brain has learned that the memory of the events is safe. The events weren't, but the memory is safe. And so you're not distracted by it if you get reminded of it, which of course you get reminded of things all the time, consciously or not. So in that sense, yes, that is exactly how I like to think about forgiveness. And it gives you, I mentioned earlier, it empowers you. It gives you the sense that, okay, I could actually do something about this. Then you can figure out if you can rebuild trust with someone, if you want to maintain, or if you need to maintain a relationship with someone. And that's a whole different set of issues. That's not an inside job. That involves both people. But the forgiveness is a really important first step. And I lay out in that book you mentioned, I lay out 3 steps to forgiveness. And of course, anytime anybody lays out 3 steps, it's partly baloney, because that's not how life works. But having said that, yes, I have my 3 steps, and I'll just briefly say what they are. The first step is to forgive yourself, because inevitably we blame ourselves when something bad happens, even if there's no moral sense we should be blaming ourselves. That's part of a survival mechanism. It's like, okay, it gives me a sense I have some control, even if I don't. So I'm apt to blame myself. So I need to forgive myself. The second step is forgive whoever hurt you. And that I claim is a fairly short step from forgiving myself, because if I've forgiven myself genuinely, if I've really gotten to the point of saying, you know what, I didn't know what I didn't know. I knew what I knew. I didn't know what I didn't know. I guess I was doing the best I could. I'm not evil or stupid or crazy. I kind of blew it, but that's what happens when you don't know enough, I could apply that to the person who hurt me too. Again, I'm not trying to say there's no moral culpability. I'm just saying, well, I guess that's what they came up with. Bummer that they did, but that's what they came up with. They were doing the best they could too. I don't have to be angry about it. Now I can figure out what do I want to do. And the third step I have a funny name for, and you don't have to be religious to appreciate this step. I call it forgiving God. And what I simply mean by that is, how could we live in this world where we have this tantalizing sense that we're in control of things, which is largely an illusion? We think we're controlling some stuff. We do have influence, but shit happens and we get hurt by it. And we need to forgive the fact that that's the case, sort of forgiving the universe for that. And I think that's a really important step too, because then it leads to a mindset that says, wow, this whole reality business is actually good to be what it is, even if it's painful sometimes. And I call that mindset faith. Again, not necessarily religious. That's what heals. That's what gets people to be able to deal with, to see the meaning in it and not just freak out and say, oh, we just want to go back to how it was, because how it was won't work. How it was is what got you into trouble.
Yeah, it's really helpful. And I think that I like the step 3 oftentimes too, because it's so easy from a standpoint of losing, say, power within oneself to start, say, projecting and say, well, this is that fault of God, the universe, that energy, whatever it is that anybody believes in. And in doing that, we can lose some sense of power. So even by saying like forgiving on that level, like energetically, the universe, God at large, we begin to like put that power, I think, back into ourselves.
Mhm.
So I think that's a really important step that a lot of people haven't talked about in this realm. So you bring up trust. And I think trust is a really important place to go next because especially since a lot of your work is with couples and relationships and that sort of thing. And that is what we talk about on this show. And many times if we're dealing with forgiveness and we're talking about forgiveness, there is a fundamental trust that probably has been broken.
Oh,
And
yeah.
right. And that leads to so much feeling for so many people of not feeling safe in their relationships, maybe not feeling safe in themselves. And I don't think like it's news to anybody that this can be a big pivotal, the loss of trust can be a big pivotal turning point that if people do want to reconcile their relationship and this is not addressed, oftentimes it's a slippery slope downhill from here.
Oh, yeah.
So where do people go, right? So it's like, okay, taking the time to forgive oneself, forgive their partner. And it sounds like this is done through a lot of like self-talk or like before I go to the trust thing, let's take a step back. And like from the standpoint of forgiveness, what is that process? I understand the 3 steps, but like if somebody's trying to take that first step to forgive themselves, what exactly are they doing there?
Yeah. So here is my gross oversimplification of that, I'm sure, Yeah. How do you lead someone there? I don't have a simple formula that says, oh, self-talk, say these affirmations and everything will be fine. I don't tend to think that's true. I think the affirmations, it's not that affirmations are bad, but the affirmations often follow from feeling better rather than the affirmations making you feel better. It's something of a bootstrap process, I suppose. I boil it back down to that one word, faith, that if you can actually practice, and it is a practice, it's not a knowledge you can learn. It's not something that, it's not something you can simply repeat to yourself. It is a practice of faith where you recognize there must be some meaning here. There's something important about this. That's how you can get to that place of forgiveness. Viktor Frankl, his book on Man's Search for Meaning, where he survived Auschwitz, one of very few people in the group of people he went with who did, and found meaning in that, in pure evil. It's not that he doesn't deny it's pure evil, but he was able to find meaning in that suffering. That's the sense of faith I'm talking about, that when you can actually have that deep sense that, God, this is painful, but you can learn from it, you can grow from it. That's how you can get to that place of forgiveness. And it takes time, like any sort of recovery from trauma.
Just a quick break to let you know that 80% of women do not have orgasms from vaginal intercourse alone. So many people are not having the type of sex that is healing, that brings them closer, that brings them more connected, that is full of so much pleasure and passion that it can build bones, reduce stress, help serotonin, bring happiness, lower anxiety, improve sleep, and build a better connection with your partner. That is what hot and modern monogamy is modern monogamy that brings in all of that passion, that desire, that closeness, and that healing. And that's what you can get at the Hot and Modern Monogamy Club. So if you're interested in that and I can help you, please go to modernmonogamyclub.com. Now back to our show.
It takes time. I was trained, I did a lot of work before I got sort of almost exclusively into couples and many years ago. I did quite a bit of work working with trauma survivors. I'm trained in EMDR and I'm trained in hypnosis. And the work there, all the various therapies that work with trauma, basically invite you to go there in your mind without freaking out. If you can actually go there without freaking the fuck out, that's basically what'll work.
Yeah.
Then you have a shot at your brain learning, oh, these memories are safe and you can recover from it. So the forgiveness process is certainly, from a therapy standpoint, is a lot about going to those places, and what the therapist is providing, I think more than any of our fancy techniques, what we're providing is faith. We're saying, wow, this whole thing it can be meaningful. You can learn from this. I've had many people go through that sort of process. I've never had anybody say to their partner, hey, thanks for cheating. Haven't heard that one yet. I've heard lots of people say, in effect, thanks for precipitating that crisis because we're so much better off now.
Yeah.
And that's what I mean by that sense of faith. If you go in with that sense that, boy, this is painful, but I'll bet we can grow from it. That's what lets you get to that place of forgiveness, I think. And you go ahead.
I was just going to say it's so well said. I mean, I think in oversimplifying things, it's really finding the silver lining, right? Which, like you said, through trauma, it's like finding a silver lining it's a daily practice and a daily work when there's so much pain and there's so much hurt. So I like that a lot. It's not as simple. Like I love EMDR and some of those other types of therapies you mentioned. And at the same time, like you said, it's like all they're doing is they're bringing that processing to the prefrontal cortex where we have reasoning so we can actually think and process these things without emotion. So we're still in many ways doing the same thing. It's just a different way of helping our brain find that silver lining so we can begin to let go of the trauma.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
right.
Absolutely. And rebuilding trust then is, first of all, it works a lot better if you can think clearly, to see if you even want to try that with a partner. And if you do, if you have good reason to want to do that, and of course, simply being a married couple or people who've been together a long time, especially if they have kids, they have enormous reason to want to do that. Even if they decide to divorce, they have enormous reason to want to be able to work together as parents. So that building of trust is a lot, I'll put it in the contrapositive terms. Is that the nerdy word? It can't happen if you haven't had some level of forgiveness because you're too distracted by panic. Even if you've forgiven, rebuilding trust then is about reaching a level of understanding sufficient to be able to say, wow, I can imagine a person that I could rebuild trust with having done something that they did. I understand it enough. I see where it came from. And I also see from them, and so to say, this involves both people. I also see from them that they understand it enough, that they have reason to be able to reassure me they wouldn't do it again. Not because it's just, oh no, we'll go back to how it was. That's nonsense. But because they've learned what they needed to learn. And they also often, the trust thing works both ways. It's really surprising. The person who was cheated on, let's say, if it was kind of, infidelity sort of situation, the person who's cheated on is often feeling, how can I trust this person not to cheat? The person who did the cheating, if they have gotten to that place of forgiving themselves, forgiving their partner, they need to trust their partner too. Among other things, they need to trust that their partner won't keep hating them or won't keep, most folks don't want to be in a permanent villain role or, permanent probationer role where their partner is then their probation officer. That's not usually how people want to live. And so to get past that requires that both parties have this real sense of that they're made whole again and they can appreciate what they went through to get there.
Do you have in your process, like anything, because I'm thinking about a situation, right, where somebody's cheated on, and I think a common thing that goes through in infidelity or in anything that's a major trauma is a question of, well, do we actually want to continue together, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because it's like there is a ton of work that goes into everything we're talking about here. Like the reparation on both sides, it can be pretty major, and it can take weeks, months, and years even to fully repair from some of this stuff sometimes. So, do you have a part of your process at all that helps individuals within the context of a couple actually go through and ask themselves questions or just do any sort of processing around what is the right step after this? Like, do I actually want to continue with this or do I want to do something else? How do you guide people that way?
Yeah, there are, of course, zillions of different approaches on this.
Yeah.
My favorite way, I don't tend to make that a binary question, certainly not early on. It's an implicit question right from the get-go. They're wondering, well, okay, how's this going to turn out? What are we going to decide to do? And I absolutely respect that from day one, and also recognize that it's often not a simple decision. It's not a simple, well, obviously we have to split up, or obviously we're going to stay together. And so you have to, one of my favorite little phrases, my wife and I, you mentioned we do a podcast, and we said, if people did a drinking game, every time I said the phrase, tolerate the anxiety, they would be drunk by the end of the podcast. I say that a lot, It's about tolerating the anxiety.
Yeah.
That sense that if you can sit with not knowing for a while, and, and I have such sympathy for people who they can't stand it. And I'm not judgmental about that. I can well understand that. The only certainty you have available to you early on in this, or any time in the process, the only thing you can be certain about is you can file for divorce in all the states in our country now. I think it's true. Either party can file for divorce, and they don't have, I think they're pretty much all no fault now, as far as I know. Maybe there's exceptions, but which is to say, you don't have to concoct some sort of scheme proving a particular sort of, abuse or infidelity or something like that. You can simply say, I want out, and you get to get out. And that at least gives you some sense of power. Well, okay, you can end it. But if you don't want to end it, you're going to be stuck with some uncertainty for a while as you go through the healing process. So, I don't have a sort of black and white approach. Now, having said that, I want to mention with respect, there are folks who do, and I'm forgetting the particular buzzword that they use to describe this, but there are folks who will say, we're going to meet for 6 weeks or whatever it is. And the focus will be solely on, do you want to continue the work or do you want to split up? That will be the sole focus. And I respect that. I don't want to work that way because it feels to me like it's making things too black and white when they need to be fuzzy for a while. But I don't know. That's not exactly a scientific argument, is it? So I respect that approach, but that's not how I like to work.
Yeah. And I think there's lots of different types and ways for different couples. And that's what's amazing about the work of many in the world, is that we get to choose the right thing for us and the right approach for us in any situation in life or in relationship. And, this thing you're talking about around or tolerating the anxiety, I think is so important, because I think it's like a rare thing in life that we're actually taught, like, especially like at a young age, to tolerate discomfort.
Yeah.
And in a world where comfort is the thing that drives, as one of the key, I think, motivational drivers for people, this thing of like being uncomfortable and being pain and being anxious is just, there's so much of this tendency to just like, what do I have to do to get rid of it as fast as possible?
Yeah.
And that's natural. That's normal. I mean, I feel that too. But from a standpoint of fixing things and of choosing things and of having time to process things and making up decisions and not making decisions in that intense nervous system state, which is not always the best decision.
Yeah.
Tolerating that is really important.
Mm-hmm.
I want to move us on, since we only have a certain amount of time today, although I feel like we could talk forever, to talk about one of the things you talk about also in your work is the difference between good sex and sacred sex.
Yeah.
So I wanted to talk about a little bit about that, especially since libido and sex is one of the things that comes up, most from our listeners as far as what they want to hear. So can you differentiate between both? And
I actually have 3 levels. I have plain old sex, good sex, and sacred sex.
Wait, what was the first one?
Plain old sex.
Oh, plain old. Okay.
I think the title of the chapter was in my book, Reigniting the Spark. The title of the chapter was Sex, Good Sex, and Sacred Sex. But the sex, I mean plain old sex. What do I mean by plain old sex? Well, anything you think it is.
Yeah.
So if you think it's sex, it's sex. Yeah, I'm not being really fussy about how I define that. It's whatever you think sex is. So obviously not just intercourse, not even just genital stuff. I mean, right. It's whatever you think of sex, broadly or narrowly. Plain old sex simply requires that you more or less not be freaking out at the very prospect. Now, people who've gone through sexual trauma, which is, of course, unfortunately, very many people, that's an issue. They need to recover from that to even be able to have plain old sex without it being horrible. So that's for plain old sex. You just need basically to not be in a state of panic. For that, it also helps to have some basic knowledge of anatomy and physiology. What's where and what does what. That's basically anatomy and physiology. And for many people, and I'm sure not to mansplain to the woman in the conversation, but I guess for a lot of women, that's a particular issue. It's like, what's down there and how's my body work? Usually men aren't unsure about what's down there and more or less how it works. Though I have to say, I want to put in a plug for you. I think as we're recording this, it's your most recent one that dropped, which was with Matt Sturm.
Yeah.
Talking about, non-ejaculatory orgasm, which I have often talked about with folks as well. And an incredibly important thing if men can manage to learn that. Anyway, all about that's plain old sex. Good sex, I simply mean simply. Good sex is when it's not just sex, it's intimate. And by intimate, I don't mean necessarily that it's quiet and romantic. It could be loud and, very, I'm shying away from the word violent, but, rough or whatever people want. But it means you're present. When you're actually present in your body. I define intimacy pretty broadly as when you are present and honest with yourself and each other. And to be that way, and nobody's that way 24/7. I am not always present with myself all the time. I'm distracted a lot. Damn smartphones, whatever. There's all kinds of ways. Life, exactly, yes. But those moments, and one of the things I claim is that couples need those moments of intimacy as much as they need stability. That's another issue. But so for good sex, you need to be actually present. And you remember we were talking about tolerating the anxiety. That's a lot about that. That's a lot about being willing to say things to your partner that you're worried your partner is going to think weird, or, fantasies, or, to be able to talk about stuff, whether it's politically correct or not, and say, "Oh, I bet, this is a fantasy, even if we don't actually enact it, that this turns me on," that kind of stuff, a conversation. So that's intimate sex, or good sex. I call that good sex. Sacred sex, to get from good sex to sacred, it's really more about the sacred than it is about the sex. Now, I think you had mentioned in that podcast I heard about Tantra, you have probably more familiarity than I do. I mean, I've read what I've read. We've interviewed several people on our podcast who are really Tantra folks.
I love it.
And it's all about that sense that whatever the sex is, it isn't just about the couple anymore. It's joining forces that are much bigger. And so that is something, as I say, much more about the sacred per se than it is about sex. Sex is just a good example. I think I mentioned in the book, why sacred sex as opposed to, sacred dish doing. And of course, some people would say, well, there is such a thing as sacred dish doing if you are present in that sense of sacred, that it can be, but the forces of sex are so amenable. They're so awesome. Literally, they're awe-inspiring. The first time anybody's had an orgasm, perhaps, if it wasn't unpleasant, and I know there are trauma situations where that happens, but often the first time someone has an orgasm, it's awe-inspiring. It's like, oh my God, where did this force come from? And that is very amenable to that sense of being joined with the universe in some much larger ways than just the two people involved, or however many people involved.
Yeah, I love it. Thank you for explaining that. I love how we can take these concepts. Like, one of my favorite things is like what happens in the bedroom or wherever we're intimate is actually a reflection in many ways of what happens outside of the bedroom. Mm-hmm. And, it's like we can take basic things that there's a lot of research on, like meditation and mindfulness and these sorts of things that also, in some sense, and in many sense, when people get deeper and deeper with practices like that, are ways of connecting to the divine, ways of connecting to the feeling of awe and all that. And I say this because I've done 36-day meditation retreats. I've gone very, very deep into the meditation world. And one of my favorite things to say is I think sex is better than meditation, right? When we're really in that sacred sex, type of thing you're talking about, and we're connected to that all and something greater and something cosmic and beautiful, and we're 100% present, are 100% present in our body. And it's a real big practice there. So do you, in your work, do you help, and is this in your book on this, do you help couples or individuals learn how to tap into these, different types of sex and how to actually start exploring them?
Yeah. I suppose if I were going to talk about what have I written about and what do I talk with folks about, I talk about the distinction. I don't lead workshops on how to get to that level of sacred sex. I mostly talk more about the intimate part.
Yeah.
So a lot of the work I do with couples, the considerable majority, I was going to say vast, I think that's true. The vast majority of couples I work with, they're not having stability issues. More often they're having intimacy issues. And intimacy is all about that. So good sex is all about that. And we're often talking about both sex and intimacy more generally. And so I do talk a lot about, ways to get there. Again, all about tolerating the anxiety. I don't talk a lot about, okay, here are some practices that can invite you into that sacred mode, other than the fact of saying, hey, read up on that stuff, or, but the more you get into, I do have a sense, and I think this is true of peak experience in general, it's not something you can engineer. It's something you can lay the groundwork for. so that, you engage in practices. This is no different from like daily prayer practices people have or daily meditation practices. You might have the occasional experience of this astonishing unity with the divine or whatever you want to say. But you can't make that happen in a given circumstance. You can simply get good at it, and then it can happen. And I think that's true of sacred sex as well. So it's, I don't have workshops on Tantra and stuff like that,
Sure.
but I mention it to people.
Beautiful. I love it. Well, I know we're about at time today. I want to make sure we know that people know how to get a hold of you. I want to make sure people know how to get your book and any other offerings and your books, I should say. I just know there's, your Betrayal and Forgiveness is the new one.
Mm-hmm.
And then, of course, I want everybody to know that we are also offering part 2 of this interview with Dr. Bruce here. And so part 2, we're talking about stability and intimacy, these two forces that are almost seem contradictory to people, where it's like, okay, how can I feel safe? How can I feel stable in a partnership? And still, how can I do all these things that cultivate that intimacy? And sometimes they almost feel like they're opposite things that are needed. Sometimes they're the same. At least that's my experience. So I'm going to talk to Dr. Bruce about that more here in part 2. So make sure you look in the show notes. And so you can understand how to access that coming out here soon.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so let's now tell us, Dr. Bruce, tell us, please, how do people get a hold of you? How do people get your book? All of those good.
Yeah, well, best bet is if you just go to brucechalmer.com, BruceChalmer, brucechalmer.com. That has sort of links to whatever you might need. That's links to my practice if people are interested in actually working with me. I do all telehealth, so that's doable. I have also links there to my books. My books are widely available pretty much anywhere you can get books. I, almost hate to do it, but I'll put in a plug for Amazon because that's the more people get on Amazon, the more people find out about it. And that's just kind of how it works these days. So if you go to Amazon.com, if you search for Dr. Bruce Chalmer, your Dr. Bruce Chalmer, you will find all of my books there, including the book I wrote in 1986 on statistics, which is still available, which is kind of hilarious. That's another story. So you'll find links to that. And then the podcast that my wife and I do, Couples Therapy in 7 Words, available on all the podcast platforms. You can search for that. Or you can go to our podcast website, which is CTIN7. That's the numeral 7, CTIN7.com. So that's how to find it.
And we'll have all of those links, everybody. We'll have all of that in the show notes from today's episode. So thank you, everybody, so much for tuning into this episode. Please, please, please do me a favor. Share this with your friends and family. This topic on forgiveness, it's just such a big, big conversation that, honestly, I think we've been trying to figure out as humans for centuries, for eons, how to do this, what it means. And I just think we can't get this information in enough people. So if you would please do me a favor and share this with friends and family and anybody you think that could benefit from this information. And thank you so much, Bruce, for being here with me today.
Well, thanks for having me on.
Everybody, we'll see you real soon for another episode on The Lounge. Take care. Thank you for listening to the Libido Lounge. Please don't keep me a secret. Please share this with your friends. You can find me on YouTube, on Instagram, as well as how to work with me at mylibidodoc.com.